you all for participating today. I just wanted to give you a brief history of how we decided to do this townwide read of the book Just Mercy. This past May, after the town had one of its, I think they've had 2 or 3 peaceful marches related to social justice. And the chairman of the Board of Selectmen at the time, Bob O'Regan, and the police chief and some people from the Stoughton organization called Stoughton Diversity and Inclusion organized this march, a peaceful vigil really, at Halloran Park. And when that ended, a couple of days later, the chairman of the board at the time, Bob O'Regan, called me up and he said, would you and the library be interested in helping us organize a town-wide read of a specific book called Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson? We had just finished our 2-month annual Stoughton Reads together in May. So this was like, oh, okay, well, let's think about this and then we'll see what we can do. So after some discussions and reaching out to a variety of stakeholders in town, we invited several people in town to be part of the Stoughton Reads planning committee for this book, Just Mercy. And by our first meeting, we had 18 interested people participate. The committee members include the Board of Selectmen, the Youth Commission, Oasis, Stoughton Schools, religious groups, the police department, Stoughton Diversity and Inclusion Organization, library staff, and a wide range of people that were just interested parties. I asked Stephanie Patton, the Oasis coordinator in town, to partner with us on this project because it's a very sensitive topic, social justice and what's going on in our country today. And we felt this program really could benefit from her skills at facilitating difficult conversations. We hope people will read this difficult book, join our programs and book discussions, and come away with a better understanding of social justice and the current unrest in our country. I'd like to introduce Stephanie Patton to say a few words about exactly what Oasis is and what they do in case people in town are unfamiliar with it. And I'll just say before I sign off, Stoughton is very lucky to have programs like Oasis and the Stoughton Youth Commission because Stephanie has a master's in public health, the Youth Commission people have degrees in social work, and this is really a time in our country where those skills can be very helpful for helping people come together and understand difficult issues. So Stephanie, if you would please tell us a little bit about what you do, that would be wonderful.
Sure. My name is Stephanie Patton. I'm the prevention coordinator for the town. I apologize. The lighting is really weird in my room for some reason, but that's okay because it means you can't see that my daughter sprayed my hair with glitter right before we came on. So if I'm glowing, that might be why. So a big piece of my work is managing the Oasis Coalition. The Oasis Coalition has been around in Stoughton for over 15 years. It is comprised of folks from town departments, local community organizations, citizens who are interested in really looking at the focus of the coalition really over the years has been around addressing adolescent substance use and preventing it. And the ways that we do that are really by involving people from all walks of the community. It's truly a collaborative effort. We do a lot of policy work. We look at community norms. And we look at really, thinking about how can we make the healthy choices for our young people the easiest choices. And a big piece of that work is really thinking about what are the things that put our young people at risk for substances, and really, in some ways, it's the same things that put any of us at risk for that. And so the tie-in for me here really is that one of the things that really puts folks at risk is really having toxic stress in their lives. And we know that racism causes toxic stress. So it's really a public health issue. And so that's sort of my long-winded way of kind of coming back around to this. And so I really think I see racism and addressing racism as a really important piece to the work that our coalition does. And I'm fortunate to be able to have so many great collaborative partnerships across the community. And so I think that only helps us as we really come together and have, what can be some challenging but really important conversations. So I'm so excited to be able to be a part of this, part of the planning committee. I'm really excited to hear from Carl. So I'm going to be quiet so that Josh can introduce him and we can get this program started. Thank you.
Great. So I just want to ask everyone else besides Carl and myself to turn off your video so we don't have any distractions in the background. We could all concentrate on his talk. If you would, I'll do that on your own. And I will introduce Carl. So Carl Boen worked for the Massachusetts Department of Corrections for 34 years as a school principal. He was essentially a regional educational administrator who provided educational opportunities, academic, vocational, college, etc., for the people that were incarcerated. He's a true believer that education can provide hope and lead to a positive reintegration back into society. He's worked at many of the prisons in Eastern Massachusetts and continues to advocate for expanded programs for incarcerated people, and he's lectured at several area colleges. Tonight, he's going to address some of these topics and more, I'm sure, and answer your questions as we go along and also at the end. First, the demographics of the prison population. What are the schools like in the prison and how that connects to the book. The issue of trying juveniles in the adult criminal justice system in Massachusetts. And finally, the concept of hope, which is incredibly important to redemption. So please welcome Carl Boen.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I've got to make a disclaimer, though. I was a resident of Stoughton for 35 years, and we moved in May. My wife and I downsized. We are in Plymouth right now, broadcasting live from Plymouth. So we miss Stoughton. We love Stoughton. My 3 girls went to school in Stoughton, and one of them is a public health expert. Good to see that, Stephanie. And I'm sure she'd like to talk to you at some point. Anyway, Just Mercy is without question a fabulous book about both social and criminal justice. I have heard Brian Stevenson many times. He is nothing short of fabulous. His eloquence, he is certainly a hero of mine. What I admire most in terms of criminal justice and social justice is the way he addresses complex problems and can look at those problems in a way that produce solutions in our society and in our government. But also, I think he talks an awful lot in the book about positive change, and I think that's so important. Josh said it. I've taught at Stonehill and Tufts University on prisons. I've lectured, especially when I was in the prison system. The superintendent of the prisons, or the commissioners, would send all the college classes to me. So I've lectured at Harvard and places like that, BU Law, Northeastern Law. And my wife is eating beside me here, and she knows I love to talk about prisons. So you can reach me anytime and I'm going to type that in also, C. Boen, and I'm teaching at Massasoit right now at massasoit.edu, and I will type that in. So anyway, I know it's a library presentation, so I got to tell you 2 of my favorite books about criminal justice and the prison systems.
You send a chat.
Carl, you're muted. There we go.
Yeah, you unmuted? There you are.
There we go. Where did I stop? I'm sorry.
You must have hit a button.
Okay. Anyway, there are 2 great books about prisons and criminal justice I've used in all the classes I've taught. And since it's a library program, I thought I'd throw that out. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander and New Jack by Ted Conover. And they are just excellent books on prisons. And I think you'd really, if you're interested in what I'm saying tonight and want more in depth, I think both of those are excellent sources. So I really don't know how long this is going to go. Usually if I kind of am giving you the same talk, I'd give a visiting college class. So usually they go an hour, but they give and take, and there's people who ask me questions. So we have the chat button. If you'd like to chat, and I have it up. So if there's something I hit and you want to ask me a question, I'll get right to it. Otherwise, we can keep it till later. I've got to make a disclaimer. I'm not an attorney. So there's things about the law. I don't know real specifics, unfortunately. And I'm not a researcher either. So if I throw out statistics, I'm probably in the ballpark, but not 100% certain. I am what they call a practitioner. I worked in prisons for 34 years. And as Josh said, I worked all over Eastern Massachusetts. I started in 1978 at Bridgewater. I went on a beautiful afternoon in late September, and Bridgewater was beautiful. It pulled in, I pulled in. I said, well, this won't be so bad. But I didn't start till late November. And I pulled in again. There were no leaves on the tree. The place was gray, dark, and foreboding. And I said, oh my God, what did I get myself into? And at the time, I didn't really care anything about criminal justice. I was just a kid from Brockton looking for a job. So 34 years later, I fell in love with the job. I love talking about prisons. I won't say it was always the easiest 34 years, but it was certainly rewarding. And I hope I can talk a bit about that when I talk about hope and some of the success stories we had. So one of the first things I always talk about when I talk about Just Mercy is how Brian Stevenson defined it, why he entitled the book Just Mercy. And this is what he said: it's a call to action for people, us, I guess, to address the racial and economic inequalities that undergird the criminal justice system, and in doing so, practice both mercy and hope. There is a lot to take out of this book. I hopefully, at the end of this half hour, 40 minutes, however long it goes, and I'm not even sure how long it's going to go, to look at prisons a little differently, to see the human side in them, that what you watch on the Discovery Channel, the most dangerous prisons in America, are only a small sliver of what prisons are really like. And just to see how that ties in with the movement in our country right now to put social justice and criminal justice on the forefront, and also have those two concepts connect. So I'm hoping in some way you look at prisons a little differently today, and that, again, feel free to ask me any questions as we go through. So I guess one of the things I have to talk about is the Massachusetts prison system, and how someone would land in the Massachusetts system. The prison system is the end of the line of the criminal justice spectrum. And as Josh mentioned, I have worked at Bridgewater. Bridgewater is a huge prison complex. It contains the Bridgewater State Hospital, the Massachusetts Treatment Center for the Sexually Dangerous. It houses Old Colony Correctional Center that is a medium security prison. I've worked there. I've worked at the Plymouth Minimum and the Forestry Camp. I worked at Walpole for almost 10 years on 1A at a maximum security prison. It is now a medium security prison. And it holds our department's segregation unit where people are really locked up for a period of time. I've worked at Norfolk, Concord, and I've worked at Framingham with the women at Framingham. So in my time, in my 34 years, I had the opportunity to work at different facilities with really different inmates and different citizens, and took a lot out, and I learned a lot from each place. So when we talk about the criminal justice system, we really talk about the spectrum from juvenile justice to the other side of it, where like I said, I always call the correctional side of the state piece the end of the road. That is as punished as a citizen can be in Massachusetts. So when we think of that, I always look at it this way: how can we intervene, and where can we intervene where that doesn't have to happen? So when we talk about the system, we talk about the juvenile system. Juvenile justice has a lot of components, But and Michelle Alexander writes about that great in the new Jim Crow, by the way, of how can we intervene before youth even land in a system like that. And I'll talk about that. And at the adult level, we have simply probation to suspended sentences, to the county system, to our state system. And I worked in the state system. The difference between the county houses of correction and the state system in which I worked is usually the felony that they are convicted of, they're sentenced to more than 2.5 years. So if you picture it that way, the state system, inmates who've been, citizens who've been found guilty of felonies are sentenced to a sentence of more than 2.5 years. That lands them in the State Department of Correction. So I always, when I talk about colleges, I'm not quite sure ever what they think an inmate is like or how an inmate landed in the state system, how their life got in such a state where they have committed a felony. They're now at the end of our criminal justice system. And I always like to tell the kids at the state, listen to me, at the state system, in colleges this, that no person who is in our Massachusetts state system has dropped out of a spaceship and landed in a prison. They were born, they grew up, they lived a life, something happened. I like, Ted Conover talks about that a lot in New Jack, that many times the people who end up in prisons have led a life of chaos, that things have occurred that, how can I put it? There has been a complete clash of all society's ills often that land a person in prison. So if I was going to talk about those ills, and we did a checklist and we had John, Jose, Mary, and Joe, and they're 4 inmates in our system. And we listed all these possible things, societal ills that may have affected that person. They would check a lot of boxes. So when we talk about those ills and how they collide and cause a person to create a crime that then leads them into this system, we have to think about, you know, really in my expertise was education, that many people who arrive in prison come without any basic skills. Their educational level is, to use this word, dismal. Many of them have undiagnosed learning disabilities. Many of them have brain damage due to traumatic injuries and substance abuses. There is also a lack of poor health and poor mental health in their upbringing in their lives, that they don't see a doctor regularly, they don't have access to mental health. And you can imagine the type of problems that creates in an individual when they cannot access that type of care. Certainly, as I mentioned, substance abuse is a huge issue. Many inmates, it used to be, and I'm quoting a statistic that I don't know how accurate it is anymore, that almost 70% of inmates created or caused their crime, committed their crime while they were under the influence of a substance, alcohol, or a drug. So substance abuse contributes to a person being at the end of that line in landing in the prison system. One thing we also see, we see lack of positive role models with our inmates, and that happened, we saw that many times, that they lacked role models either in the home or the community. And that doesn't necessarily mean parents. Their parents may have been working 2 or 3 jobs. They may have been unemployed. Their parents may have been suffering from many of the things that, the factors I'm bringing up right now. Certainly poverty factors in, particularly when they get involved in the legal system, what kind of representation they're going to have, that is a huge issue. Do they have the skills to cope? And though if they don't have those skills, you will see bouts of anger and the inability to cope, solve problems, And as Brian Stevenson also said, racism is a huge factor in our society that can cause folks to be incarcerated, certainly a systematic racism. And as Stephanie said, that underlying stress of racism certainly factors in. So those are some of the societal ills, and I like to tell the college kids this, that collide. And if we had to check off what occurs in any inmate's life, they would check a number of those boxes. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And I'm going to go here. And can you see my screen okay? Oh, they're muted.
Yep, we can see it.
Oh, great. All right. So this is from the Department of Corrections website. And they give you some quick statistics. And I am so proud of the Department of Corrections because they now are updating them monthly. There were times that I'd go in and try to lecture at universities or college and I'd have 3 or 4 year old statistics. These are updated on August 1st of this year. Fabulous works. So here's the male population in the state prison. There's 7,078 males. I need to tell you that is way down. That population is not quite in half, but when I left in 2013, there were probably 12,000 inmates in the system. So that is significantly lower. And be proud of Massachusetts. Massachusetts incarcerates far less people than almost any other state. I know we're either 1 or 2, I'm not sure. So our per capita incarceration rate is incredibly low. There are only 6,500 criminally sentenced, and there are civil commitments. Those civil commitments are in Bridgewater. They are either civilly committed because they're sexually dangerous, or they're civilly committed because they are mentally ill, and probably were found not guilty by reason of insanity. So those 541 civil commitments are generally in Bridgewater, and like I said, they're either sexually dangerous or found not guilty by reason of insanity. The second statistic is interesting, that average age continues to get higher, probably as we incarcerate fewer people. The age of the population has certainly risen over time. That would have to be one of the oldest ages in the nation, the average age of 43 years. So like I said, the next statistic, and I don't want to bore you with these, is that they are doing more than 2.5 years in the state system. So that's 97% of the population, 76% of prisons. Massachusetts prison have a violent governing offense. They've committed a violent crime. The mandatory drug sentences are on their way out, although people are still sitting in Massachusetts prisons with a governing offense of a mandatory drug sentence, and there are 450 of those. So here is where we at. Here is what Boen did, and this was updated on January 1st of 2019. So here is when I talk about poor education, 42% of the Massachusetts male DOC come in with less than a 9th grade reading level, and 44% cannot do math above a 6th grade math level. So that is entering the department. As you can see, that would not be equal to our population at large by any stretch. They give a little bit about recidivism here, that in a 3-year recidivism rate, and the last time they did this was 2014. This is an old statistic. 32% of the prison population upon release recidivated came back to prison within 3 years. And then they talk a bit about the mental health cases in the state prison population. 35% of the male prison population open mental health case. 8% have a serious mental health illness, and 25% were on psychotropic medications. So those statistics, again, are higher than the population at large. And here's our female population. There's only 228 women in Framingham. That is again, down considerably. I worked in Framingham in the early 90s, and there were probably 500 women there at the time. So that number has significantly decreased over the years. Again, their average age is somewhat older than other states, 42. The youngest inmate, they tell us, is 20, and the oldest is 75. And they, again, are similar to men. 92% are serving a sentence of more than 3 years. 72 have a violent governing offense. So if you read into this, Massachusetts laws right now are trying to put violent people behind bars and see if we can find a way to keep the other folks, if we can intervene in a way where they do not need the type of security that a state prison would have. And the women, as you'll see, are considerably smarter. 29% entered the department with less than a 9th grade reading level, and 34% with less than a 6th grade math level. Of note, down bottom, that mental health cases, more women have more open mental health cases. It is a huge part of Framingham. 74% were open mental health cases. 15% had serious mental illness, and 56%, more than half of Framingham, are on a psychotropic medication. So I don't want to bore you with any more statistics. And let me see where I am here. So let me talk to you about prison schools. So we try to address some of those statistics you just saw. We always, if you want a basic statistic that always seems to work and has worked as well in 1978 as it does right now in 2020, about half of all inmates, both male and female, come into prison without a high school diploma. Many of them are special ed students. They have special needs. Many had undiagnosed learning disabilities in public schools. And what we also saw was, particularly with the male population, we had a lot of people with traumatic brain injuries. We had a lot of folks, I would say, I can think anecdotally that many of them had injuries due to their crimes, that they were assaulted and were damaged in a way that learning became real difficult. So a lot of our focus was on special education, adult basic education, helping people to get some basic skills so they could survive to some degree in society. And also one of the other skills that we spent a lot of time with was English as a second language, that people who were going to stay in the United States really needed English skills to help them with employment, further ed and education, and all the things we need to work in, to live in our society. So on the academic end, we had special education all the way up through a GED equivalency program. On average, probably when I left, we probably maybe between 500 to 600 inmates a year got their GED or high school equivalency. And it was a great honor for them. We had a graduation at the end of the school year, much like any other school. And I always thought we invited the families in, they would come, they'd come to graduation. And I always thought of the families because that probably the last time they saw this man or the woman was the time he or she was being sentenced. So what a good feeling of hope that a parent could see someone, not in their worst moment, but certainly in one of their better moments, that they're accomplishing something, that feeling that prison has a use. Here's someone at least using their time to get their high school diploma. We had a number of vocational programs. I'm going to talk about vocational for a minute, because as you can imagine, the prison system, they get very security conscious about the internet. And that became a huge problem for us. How do you conduct a computer lab without an internet? It was not the easiest thing I've ever done as a prison administrator. So there were many times, particularly with vocational education, we had to simulate the internet. I have not been in prison in a few years now. I still don't think they give the inmate population access to the internet. I would be shocked if they did. They are very cautious about that and are concerned about the security of inmates having access. What it did on an educational aspect is like, oh my God, what do we do? How do you do anything without technology on this planet anymore? So we simulated as best we could. That's all I can tell you. It was not a work that was easy, and oftentimes I'm not even quite sure how successful we were. But we had a technology lab, we had a computer lab that was simulated. We offered programs in welding, in an HVAC, and our belief was if someone had their high school diploma, could get another skill, the likelihood of at least addressing some of those factors, all those factors I mentioned earlier, lack of employment, we could certainly throw in there. If someone had some basic skills and an ability to at least get a job with some of those skills, that would be some of the hope that we would look for. Culinary arts was a huge program in prison. I will say this, you can write this down if you want. Inmates love to cook. But better yet, if they're in the culinary arts program, they don't have to eat prison food. So when they were with us and they were cooking, they did exceptionally well. I would say the letters that I got back and received from inmates who had been released, many of them were people who were graduates of our culinary arts program, and they were doing exceedingly well. We had some executive chefs who came out of prison cooking classes, and it just thrilled us when we got those letters. And it really was a special feeling when we talk about hope. And what prison in their best way can do is to give someone skills to lead a better and a new life. So some of the programs we had, I think I've mentioned the computer lab, welding, culinary arts. They taught barbering because they had to give all the inmates on the population and also the women at Framingham haircuts. So they taught barbering, and you could go, the prison haircuts were done by our barber school. And so we had automotive repair at a couple programs. And oftentimes the program depended on the security level. So if you were at high level maximum security, they offered programs that didn't compromise security. So oftentimes the program like automotive repair was done at a minimum security prison. And I've worked all those spectrum from the supermaxes at Walpole to minimum securities down at minimum. So a lot of the vocational shops depended on the security level of the facility. Anyway, in chapter, let me move on. If you have any questions, Maura asks, that's awesome. Is there spiritual counseling and programs too? Yeah, Maura, right now I'm talking, my expertise was the education programs, and they were academic, vocational, and I forgot to mention college. Let me talk about college before I answer your question, Maura, and I'll get to that. We had college programs were funded by the Pell Grant up to the early to mid 90s. Don't quote the date on me on that. And the Pell Grant got done away with by the federal government. So Pell Grants for inmates were ended by the federal government for inmates. So if you're sitting in a state facility, didn't matter what state you were in, that you were not eligible for a Pell Grant, the Pell Grants funded our college program. So that effectively kind of put an end. At that time, I was at Bridgewater at the time, we had an associate's program from Massasoit Community College, and we had a 4-year program from UMass Boston. And depending on what prison you were in, we had different colleges affiliated with us. Mass Bay covered Walpole and Norfolk, and BU covered Walpole and Norfolk. So again, depending on what region of the state you were in, we had college covered. But effectively, the ending of those Pell Grants did away with the college program to that extent. What occurred later on is that BU continued to volunteer, Boston University continued to volunteer at Norfolk, Bay State, and with the women at Framingham. They had, at one time, a 100% success rate if someone left prison with a college degree from BU, and at one time, I believe it was 60 inmates, and that was years ago, the last time I heard the statistic. I'd be interested to hear it in 2020, that no one had returned to prison. I don't know if that's true anymore. At the time it was. So you can see that as people get those kind of skills that address those factors that lead people to prison, coping, better education, employability skills, they are certainly less likely to return. There are college programs now. President Obama was a big believer in correctional education. He funded programs with the Youthful Offender Grant, and I'm not sure of their status right now. I don't want to tell you that I do know, but there certainly has been a rise in certainly people talking about college programs and their importance in the prisons. More asked, are there spiritual counseling in programs too? There is certainly spiritual counseling. All the prisons have clergy affiliated with us and volunteers. And if I can impress upon you and you hear something that Boen says that says, wow, I would not mind volunteering at a prison, they are always in need of people to counsel, to offer programs. I don't know, I have to think with COVID, they're very restricted right now, but I would think in the future they won't be. There are many other programs in prison, and you can actually, if you go on mass.gov and call up, and I'm going to type that for you, type the Department of Corrections. You will find all sorts of information on each prison and what program that that prison offers. And they also ask for volunteers, quite frankly, for people with special skills who want to offer a prison program to inmates. So one of the chapters in the book, I have to talk about this because it impressed me, because I was actually deposed in a court case that had to do with juveniles in prison who were sentenced to natural life. So there is no death penalty in Massachusetts, but we had juveniles at the time under the age of 17 who were convicted of sentences where you could impose the life sentence, usually first or second degree murder. And they were found guilty at age 15, 16 of murder and were in our adult prisons. We had one inmate who was the youngest person ever. He worked in the school. They thought it was a positive environment for such a young person who was in the adult system, and I got to know him very well. I wrote a letter for his parole board a couple months ago, and I'm not sure how his parole hearing came out. I haven't heard from him since. My point is this: in the book, in chapter 6, they talked about it's aptly named "Surely Doomed" is the title of chapter 6, and it talks about when a juvenile, especially in the South, was convicted not only of murder but then a death sentence and a life sentence in other instances. And that was overturned in the courts by Miller versus Alabama, that found giving a juvenile life sentence is tantamount to cruel and unusual punishment and has been ruled unconstitutional. What happened in Massachusetts was those people who were found guilty were then automatically bound over to a second degree sentence where they see a parole board after 15 years. So the inmate I spoke of that we worked up in the school for many years with me, and he arrived when he was at age 15, has seen the parole board. So he has finished his 15 years, and now he sees the parole board and they can be granted parole. I looked very briefly the other day. There have been juveniles who have gone this route and are back out in our society. And I always think of that. The folks in prison today, outside of that population that is serving a first-degree murder sentence, they don't have an opportunity for parole. Everyone else is going to be joining us back in society. So what kind of person do we want joining us? certainly someone with skills and education brings about a great change and gives them hope. So Surely Doomed struck with me, just the title of it, and thinking back, and when I've had 15, 16, and 17-year-olds in our schools, and they're also trying to live in an adult facility. So anyway, I want to share my screen with you one more time and talk a bit about hope here, because hope is a huge thing in prisons. We try to give inmates hope and an opportunity to change. And this is so you can tell, this is my all-time favorite prison movie. No, my wife's beside me, she's saying, oh God. Not only my favorite prison movie, but my favorite movie. And there is Andy Dufresne in red up on the wall. They say it's Maine. By the way, this prison's in Ohio. And Andy says to Red, hope is a good thing, maybe the best of good things. And no good thing ever dies. So I want to tell you and just give you some insight about 2 success stories we had. And it really has to do with hope, because these 2 folks really never gave up hope. I will use pseudonyms for them, so I don't want to cross over any legal boundaries. Let me tell you about Kenny first. Kenny was a young kid. He was something, Kenny. He got in a great deal of trouble as a juvenile. He got in a shootout with the state police at age 20. He was an incredibly cocky young man who didn't live by society's rules. That would go without saying. The state police and the courts did not look upon Kenny favorably, and he got sentenced to 25 years for that crime. He was a bank robber at age 20 in his early 20s. Like I said, he got in a shootout with the state police. Thankfully, no one was harmed in that, not physically anyway, in that crime. And Kenny landed with us at Walpole. Kenny was probably the hardest working inmate I ever met. He didn't have a high school diploma when he came in. And his educational functioning level would have been on that statistics chart I showed you earlier. But there was an innate, almost brilliance to the kid. He was incredibly bright and very talented. He got his high school diploma in prison. At the time when colleges were going on, he got his associate's degree from Massasoit, got his 4-year degree when we were affiliated with Curry College out of Milton, and was really just an exceptional student. With that, you could see the maturity in him raise, and also the intelligence. This was a bright, capable young man. He finally got paroled. Last time I conversed with Kenny, he was working in the college in their help unit. He helped students with writing. That was his expertise, and was doing incredibly well, and was hoping to become an adjunct professor. He was working on his master's at the time, and he was doing exceptionally well. I often think of Kenny because he would have been really one of society's throwaways when we think about it. Someone who had such a long sentence. And was there any hope for him? Was there any possibility of change? And could we see a future with Kenny? So he probably left prison in his early 40s. I know he hasn't returned, and I'm sure he's doing quite well. The other inmate I'd like to talk to you about is when I first got to Walpole in the early 80s. I was a young school principal and had many inmates who worked for me. One of them was this enormous bear of a man. I'll call him Bobby. He was probably 6'8", 280. He was absolutely enormous, one of the biggest people I've ever seen. He was actually our school clerk. So the 80s were a little different than they were in the 2000s, that inmates had a little bit more freedom. Bobby would answer the phone for me and do reports and things like that. He had murdered someone. He got found guilty of manslaughter after a bar fight went bad and someone came at him with a knife and Bobby shot him. So the courts didn't look favorably on someone who shoots someone else, even if he claims self-defense. For Bobby, he got a shorter sentence than Kenny did. He was doing a 7 to 10, 7-year minimum, 10-year maximum for manslaughter. Bobby had his, he was a bright, capable person, had his high school equivalency before he came in. He too, he worked for me for about 2 years. I always kept track of him. He wrote letters back to me. I heard from Bobby a lot, and I also ran into him when I got to Norfolk. He finished his 4-year degree at Norfolk, did exceptionally well, became a manager at the Pine Street Inn. There was an obituary. Bobby passed away. I believe he died of cancer 3 or 4 years ago, and there was just an absolutely touching obituary of Bobby, how prison had changed his life for the better, thank God. So those are my 2 examples of hope, the folks who didn't give up hope, and we gave them a little bit of hope that things could be better through education. And with that, I'm trying to think what I didn't cover here. And I'd love to answer any questions that you have. So if you want to unmute and ask me a question, Josh, if you want to tap something in the chat, we're about at 45 minutes. So, wow, I didn't know how long we were going. Josh, do you want to unmute folks, or I'm not sure how it works when we mute everyone.
So people should unmute themselves if they want to ask a question, I think, or type it in the chat, either way.
Sure.
That probably is, so we don't have everyone speaking at once.
I know that Courtney Bowen down bottom has a question. It's funny, similar last names. That was a joke. She's my daughter.
So we have a question in the chat. If someone doesn't take a special interest in an inmate, can they still make it out to a successful life?
That's a great question. I'm not quite sure what you mean by special interest. I can talk from my experience at Norfolk. Norfolk has 1,500 inmates. We had 6 teachers. So what we did is, rather than have enormous waiting lists, we tried to have shorter classes. So a class may only meet for an hour to a day. But what we found was, at least it gave people hope that they were involved in something positive while they were incarcerated. It made no sense to me to have an all-day school and only be able to enroll, I don't know, 100 students, where we could get 400 in, at least part-time. So that made more sense. So we didn't have a lot of special interest, other than we got to know them fairly well. And they did accept our counsel. And some of them weren't the nicest students either, I gotta tell you. But sometimes we turned around that ugliness, and with just being there and just showing up every day and saying, hey, we're here for you. If you want to do this, let's go, let's get to work. And we never kind of soft pedal that we had to work, you know? So the special interest, that's a great question. We always did our best. I will say that I had great committed staff, because quite frankly, if someone wasn't committed and if someone wasn't really good, they left after a year or two. They just couldn't do it, you know? So that was a very good question. Thank you.
Carl, can you talk about a couple of the teachers that stood out and why you think they had a major impact?
Sure, absolutely. First and foremost, I think when they engaged in a way, I had a terrific teacher who taught math from Fall River, and many students, especially with a class like math, that's so structured and sequential in their young life when they're up to, 12 years old. Their lives were not structured or sequential. They missed a lot of school. They changed schools. They had undiagnosed learning disabilities. So we had a terrific math teacher, and like I said, he was from Fall River. And instead of trying to teach a traditional algebra or fraction, it'd say, all right, guys, we're going to do the Fall River method today. And they'd love it because for some reason that connected to, wow, he's not doing it the way I didn't learn. So he connected to he connected it to a way that they learned, that it was a new method that wasn't, hey, I wasn't good at this. Let me try this new way. And he connected it in a way that they really did learn. It was really an exciting thing to see. So when you talk about a good staff, that he immediately comes to mind. So Pat asked, did you see examples of racism between the staff and prisoners or between prisoners? And how did the prison system address this? Was there training? So let me start at the end. There was training, Pat. Not sure how good it is or was. Did I see examples of racism between the staff and prisoners? Yes. So we have about 5,000 state employees, or we did back then, who were employed by the Department of Corrections. So as you can imagine, out of 5,000 folks, we had one or two racists. I saw it at times, of course we did. And I would address it when I saw it. I wouldn't say it was more hidden from me because in the school we were fairly isolated. You would hear inmates talk about racist officers or racist staff members. That was not uncommon. How did the system address it? There was certainly a system in place for inmate grievances, and I think it would be largely dependent on the climate a particular commissioner or superintendent would create within the system. We had some commissioners who were very good, very cognizant of racism and would address it, and then there were others who I would say were not, and that would not address it. The racial climate of prisoners, there is racism certainly amongst the prison population. Inmates tended to group together. Not always. I won't say that in any specific way, but they tended to group together. Massachusetts, thankfully, does not have much of a prison gang problem the way a California or a Texas or a Florida would. There were white supremacists. We were trained on tattoos to pick them out, and my wife still says that I look at people's tattoos in a strange way that only a person who worked in prison would. So I cannot dispute that racism existed in the system. It certainly did. And I think that we could do better at it. Pat, you asked, was there training? I would say if there was a thing we could do better as a system, it would be to train people. And to read a book like Just Mercy would be a fabulous thing for staff to do. Do you want to make any connections between your experience and the book Just Mercy? Absolutely. The first experience I'd like to talk about, the first connection rather, is the very beginning of the book when Brian Stevenson walks into the Alabama prison system as a defense attorney representing someone who's either doing a life sentence or he's sitting on death row. I can only imagine what that experience and that connection is. Walking into prisons, especially the first few times, is a very difficult experience. You were entering into a world that is outside the realm of anything you've ever done. I can only imagine his nervousness. And also, when I read that first chapter of him walking into the Alabama prison, I thought back when I first began in those experiences when I walked into Walpole, that it was fearful, that if I was scared, I wasn't going to show it, and I was scared, that it's extremely stressful. And the people, the other connection, both the inmates and staff that Brian writes about reflect very closely, a very close connection to the people I met in Massachusetts, that the people both who work in prisons and the citizens who are incarcerated in prisons, they are the folks in Massachusetts. Although you may find them in his book, they are with us in Massachusetts. That is no doubt. There have been people that I had in our prison school who were wrongfully accused. And once a year, I will grab the Globe when the story comes out and I'll point it out to my wife. Here is so-and-so. Karen, look what happened. They've been found not guilty due to they were wrongfully accused. There's been testimonies, there's been evidence that clearly state that Joe, Harry, Jose, Mary did not commit this crime. So there are many connections that I've seen that where that's occurred. And
More questions, folks?
those are some great questions, though. So I've also got to have a disclaimer. I have not watched the movie yet, so I'm looking forward to watching it. But like I said, the book is fabulous. It is such a realistic view of prisons, incarceration, wrongful accusals, having those cases overturned, the legal process. Thank the Lord, we do not have the death penalty in Massachusetts in its applications. So I want to thank you for hearing me. I hope you kind of see prisons in a different view. And I've been able to at least give you some things to talk about in this age when we are talking about social justice and criminal justice, that I've enlightened you at least a little bit anyway.
Great. Thank you, Carl.
You're very welcome.
Our next scheduled program is for a discussion based on the TED Talk, We Need to Talk About It in Justice by Brian Stevenson. You can find that on our website in the event calendar and flyer, which I just shared. To register just for the discussion, the link to the TED Talk is on the event calendar and on the flyer. So finally, Pat Bassler has some final words and wanted to share something with you all.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I have a face mask that the SOLA organization, which is the Friends Group of the Library, made. And they donated 500 of these to help us promote the program. So there's a logo on the side that says Stoughton Reads, Just Mercy. People who request the book, we can send it out to them in their front porch pickup. And if you are on the committee or you're interested and you just want a face mask for help us promote this program, just call the library and we'll put one in an envelope for you. Every day from 9 to 4, we have front porch pickup for people to retrieve their books or laptops and this face mask or anything else that the library can provide for them. So thank you very much. Thanks, Josh. Wonderful job, Carl. Josh, you're muted.
Thank you, Pat. Look for more virtual programs on our website coming this fall. And we should have at least a couple of book discussions and a showing, an outdoor showing of the movie, which is in the works. So with that, wish you all good night and thank you for joining us.